Once upon a time, there was a peasant. He had a hard life, working all year round, little better off than a slave, and with no say in what went on. He was diseased, he was downtrodden, and he was dirty. Who on earth would want to have been a medieval peasant?
Bless your shirt.
Being a peasant in the Middle Ages must qualify as the worst job in history. But of course we're only guessing, because being peasants, they didn't leave behind much record of their existence.
Medieval feudal society was a pyramid with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom doing all the hard work. Nobody, not even the lords, owned any land. They simply had the use of it as long as they provided military service for the king. The peasants toiled in the fields, supporting those with more important things to do, like praying and fighting each other.
Yeah, it's an excellent system, if you ask me. Stinking peasants.
But since the lord of the manor was often away from his estate, fighting in the king's wars, he had to be able to rely on his peasants to organise themselves.
In many ways, a medieval peasant had more say in how his life was run than most people do now. Of course, it's a way of life that's all gone, and we'll never know what it was really like to live under such a system.
Sometimes, however, they resorted to rather unconventional tactics. For example, in 1200, King John proposed a visit to the city of Nottingham. The residents of the nearby village of Gotham realised that this meant he would pass through their village, making it a king's highway, and thus making them liable to new taxes. So when the king's messengers arrived, what did they do? Well, the entire village pretended to be mad. Since madness was considered contagious, the idea of a whole village of lunatics was perfectly feasible, and the king wisely decided to make a detour. But for all their cunning, surely peasants were still nothing more than slaves. In the same way that the lord of the manor had to provide military service to the king, the peasants had to provide the lord of the manor with so many days' labour in return for the land they held from him. Historians have given this arrangement the catchy title of feudal burden. But just how much of a burden were these feudal duties?
For example, the peasants who ploughed these fields 600 or 700 years ago bore one of the heaviest feudal burdens in the kingdom. That is to say, they had to work for the lord of the manor for something like 50 to 60 days in the year to provide their accommodation and pay their tax.
What's more, the feudal arrangement was a two-way thing. The lord had responsibilities to his peasants. In fact, twice a year he was supposed to lay on feasts for them as a sort of thank you. I can't remember the last time the taxman took me out for slap-up dinner. Or a picnic. Of course, the lord of the manor lived like a lord. But what kind of a stinking hovel would his peasants have called home? But I'm still a bit nervous about what they had to eat.
It's this.
Pottage.
Evidently, the recipe for pottage is take anything and put it into a pan of water and boil it up for 2 hours. Now, the reason you have to boil everything you pick out of the fields for 2 hours is because they used human excrement on the fields. So even lettuce had to be boiled, which made the salads rather soggy. Anyway, let's try the pottage. Well, it's pretty disgusting. But you could have cheered it up, I suppose, with a few herbs, maybe even some garlic. They also had an instant form of pottage, and you could take this into the fields with you, and then you could liquefy it with a bit of beer and eat that if you wanted to. Of course, they tended to drink alcoholic drinks rather than water because the water was usually not very drinkable.
Every village was dominated by its church, and the peasants' social life revolved around it.
The medieval church certainly knew how to attract a congregation.
It was the place where the peasants had their parties, where they did their amateur dramatics, and where they even held football matches. Oh, and the local priest often used to brew his own beer. The bones reveal that some peasants lived well into their 60s, and whilst there are signs of malnutrition, their diet did have its benefits.
One of the upsides is that they did have quite good dental health. There's very little tooth decay, and we can see
That's
here,
because they're not having sugar and stuff like
they're
that.
not having sugar, and also it's on a very coarse diet, which tend to scour the teeth clean.
Yeah.
And we can see this here, and that means that there's no chance for dental decay to get started.
But a toothbrush still wouldn't have gone amiss in some cases.
If we look at this one here, as you can see, these huge shaggy deposits on the teeth.
Oh, it's disgusting.
Right, well, this is actually mineralised dental plaque. This has accumulated over the years of his life. And that shows quite clearly there's no effort at oral hygiene amongst these people.
Oh, God, he must have had terrible breath.
Chronic halitosis seems to have been a bit of an issue. In Wales, a peasant woman could divorce her husband on the grounds of bad breath. Clearly, they weren't stupid. And there was worse to come. Peasants were about to come face to face with their real enemy, sheep. You see, your average lord could make more money out of sheep than he could out of peasants. And for a start, there's a lot more wool on a sheep, and you can eat them, which is possible with peasants, but socially tricky. So the lords started to throw the troublesome and uneatable peasants off the land and replace them with these chaps. The social landscape of Britain changed forever. It deteriorated when the lords fenced in the land, and it got even worse in the Industrial Revolution, and small farmers are still up against it. The life of the peasant depends on the society. But it's sobering to think that compared to a lot of people's lives today, some medieval peasants had it pretty good.